who are given to it. And we made mention in these that the four of these, the power to retain spirit, the power over death, there is no discharge from war, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. And so in all four of these, they all refer to the idea of death, which is an important aspect in the book of Ecclesiastes. He's constantly going back to life under the sun, which terminates under the sun in death. Of course, the point of view of Ecclesiastes is ultimately that there's something beyond the sun, but most of the book is written from the aspect or the attitude that if this is all there is, and so the idea here is that there is no discharge from war, there is no way that we can avoid death. And so in Ecclesiastes verse 8 and verse 9, all this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun when man had power over man to his hurt. Verse 9 serves as kind of the conclusion to the previous statements and ties it all together into the next section. All this, he says, looks, we would say that it kind of looks backwards to what he's already said. All this, and says, then his other statements are about his careful observation. Notice, I observed while applying my heart. And so he is doing his earthly best, we might say, to understand what is happening in life. And he says that there is this abuse of power over man to his own hurt. That's when man had power over man to his hurt. The power may refer to the king's power or authority, that the supreme word. For example, in verse 4, we're not going to go back and look at all this because we need to hurry through. We often say that absolute power corrupts how? Absolutely, right. And so the hurt is to the one under the abuser's power. And it is true that there are people all around the world, even today, and we can certainly look at it at times, of feudalism and monarchies and despotism and things like that we see during the contemporaries of Solomon, but even today there are those who are under people's power or people's authority and are abused because of it, and so it is to their hurt. Then I saw, he's observing, and he says, then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place and were praised in the city where they had done such things. This also is a vanity. The time frame reference then closely connects the two sections, from what he's observed and now this is what he has seen, based upon applying his heart to wisdom, as well as the connection, I think, to death, all the way back in verse 8, where you have that fourfold description of death, which is unavoidable. The wicked are often praised for their, or for some patronage that they deign to give to certain charities. And you think about they go into the holy place. Are there people who, with their wealth and their power, do many wicked things, and yet they go to church somewhere, or they found a hospital somewhere and their name is on it? Well, certainly there is. And the idea is that here are these wicked people who are trying to put a dressing or a top coat on their wicked ways. We're not talking about people who might possibly be wicked. He's telling us outright that these are wicked people. I saw the wicked buried, and yet where do they go? They go into the holy place. What's the holy place? It's the temple. They're going to the temple. Why are they going? They're going to worship. So they're worshiping and they're sacrificing. They're doing everything that they should do possibly in the temple, and they were praised in the city, right? Think of those who maybe have ill-gotten gain, or at least questionably gotten gain, and yet because they give it to certain charities and certain causes, people praise them for their philanthropy. Never mind that they got their money through abusing people and stepping on people as they're going up the ladder of life, but because they will give a pittance of what they've taken to a charitable cause, then people say, well, look, we're so glad that they were here, and they show gratitude and praise for their minor moral diversions. And really, that's what it is. It's not that they're committed fully to morality. It is a moral diversion from their most often wicked life.
When I first was reading this, I was wondering, I realize the context, I understand where you're going. But when I first read this, it sounded like when you have a wicked king, and then he dies, and he's still buried with honors, even though everybody knows he doesn't really deserve it, but they do it anyway.
Absolutely. That's exactly what it is. And their reputation lives beyond their life. That king's life. Think about how many times in the book of, First and Second Kings it makes reference to previous kings. He did not walk in the in the paths of righteousness as his father David did. David became a standard, his reputation. But there was also Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who also was a wicked man, and they walked in that way. So the idea that their reputation lives on long after them. In fact, he'll get into that also in verse 9. There may even be the thought that these wicked dead people are still being praised. And that's what's frustrating the preacher so much. It makes it clear that popular moral judgments can be warped and led astray by the evidence of success or failure, or even construing heaven's patience as its approval. Well, he must be a good guy because look how God is prospering him. Sometimes the devil prospers us because it's in that moment that he's got us. It's not always God doing the prospering. Dale?
Yeah, it's just the fact that even back then and today the same thing. It's looking at people through their worldly accomplishments and what they've done in this world as opposed to what they have done for God.
Right. And that fits into the... Absolutely, and that fits into the under-the-sun perspective that permeates the book of Ecclesiastes. The ESV translates here that they were praised. Some translations say forgotten. With the attitude that the preacher has here, that this frustration that he has, it seems that he'd be more frustrated if the dead that were wicked in their lives are now praised after than forgotten. We would want the wicked to be forgotten, but they're not forgotten; they're praised, and that just adds to his frustration. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God because they fear before him. Unpunished sin and evil flourishes. That's just a simple fact. This is what frustrates the preacher in verse 10. These wicked have done all these wicked things, and yet because of a few kindnesses or because they've gone to church, as it were, people seem to overlook all the evil that they have done. And there's no judgment or justice executed against them for what they have done. There are special times in the biblical history where God's justice is meted out immediately, right? Nadab and Abihu, for example, in Leviticus 10, or Uzzah in 2 Samuel chapter 6, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram in Numbers 15 or 16. However, those are, we would say, memorable and notable because it was out of the norm. God does not always mete out his punishment immediately. Now, what's amazing is we tend to focus on those and we say, well, look at the character of God. The character of God is that he metes out punishment immediately. God, strike me down if I'm lying, right? Because we expect God to mete out punishment. But the reason why those accounts even made the biblical history is because they were unusual. What God usually does is allow people to live their life out, giving them plenty of time to repent, plenty of time to come to their senses, plenty of time to rely on God. And if they fail to do that in this lifetime, then they will be punished on the day of judgment. They will receive their punishment then. Frank?
Yeah, I see this all the time where people have this impression that it's only a crime if you're caught. It's only against the law to catch you.
Right. And how does this apply to us? Is that principle still true, that because judgment is not executed speedily, we're set to do evil? Naomi first.
I think it just helps us to really understand that. It helps us to carry on doing right, knowing that, it's okay, that God's got it under control, and we just can't worry about that, but we just need to continue on the right path.
Yes. Rochelle?
That's kind of what I was going to say. His hand is going to do whatever it's going to do. Now,
Okay. Becca?
We also need to check our hearts to make sure we're not going through the motions and doing things that look right and getting the praise of people.
Sure.
when our
Sure.
heart is not right.
So we have this idea, though. Oh, Dale?
Yeah, I was just gonna add to that, it's about how we're living, and God knows how we're living, and it's as the verse where we're standing before God, and he says, we did this, we did this, we did this, he says, I never knew you, pardon me.
Yeah.
And so I think that's, at that moment, that's kind of what that's talking about. You may think you're on the right path and doing the right things, but at some point, in the end,
Think about our criminal justice system here. Someone commits murder, right? They go through a trial. They're caught. They go through a trial. It's a year later now. They're found guilty, and they're put on death row, right? And judgment ought to be executed speedily, but what do? We keep them on death row for 5, 10, sometimes 15 years. What's punishment supposed to do? Deter, exactly. And if we are not, executing judgment speedily, if we are not executing the punishment quickly, then people will think, well, I can get away with this. Now, I say the criminal justice system, what I really mean is your home. So you're raising kids, and your child misbehaves, and you think, well, that wasn't that bad. I'm going to let this one slide, right? I don't have time to deal with it right now. Sometimes we don't, right? And so what's the child going to do? It's going to say, well, that must be okay. And so their heart is set within them to recommit the crime. Or even if it's not, if it's not done speedily, I would say also if it's not done consistently. It has to be done consistently. Michelle?
My kids specifically will use my past against me to justify what they do. It's the exact same thing.
Yeah,
I wasn't struck down, so why would they be?
right. And exactly. And so if we're going to, this to me is one of the most important principles of parenting is, little children, teenagers, this is an important aspect, is consistent and speedy execution of punishment. There's no reason to be dragging this out. The wait till your father comes home mentality really isn't a good mentality. Look, if you can't handle it, before he gets home, then every time dad's not home, then the child thinks, well, he can get away with things until dad gets here. And that's not good for mom or dad. Frank?
yeah, swift punishment builds a strong conscience. And it's our conscience that God gives us as a tool to guide our actions. Hopefully we use it, if we do something wrong, God's not the only one to know about it. We know about it too. So, for
That's going to hurt if I do that. You know, did I see a hand up over here just a second ago? Okay. Before we go on, 2 Peter 3, beginning in verse 3, knowing this, first of all, that scoffers will come in the last days with scoffing, following their own sinful desires. They will say, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. Because judgment was not meted out swiftly every time, it must not be happening. Well, guess what? Eventually it's still going to happen. And, we need to understand that just because it doesn't happen right now, it will happen eventually. But in our minds, we need to know that judgment in our lives ought to come quickly. Fit the crime, be appropriate to the crime, or the misbehavior, and done quickly, so that there's not a desire or set in their hearts, well, maybe I'll get away with it this time, or I'll get away with it next time. Jennifer.
So I can see where people get confused because it sounds contradictory. Well, we should carry out punishment immediately, but God waits 400 years. And obviously, I think I know the answer to this. God's time is not our time. And yet it feels like, well, why do we get punished immediately? Or shouldn't we get punished immediately when God waits 400 years or more?
Ultimately, God's punishment and reward system is for life after the Son. But his punishment on earth during the under the sun time is in the nation of Israel. When someone committed a crime, the nation was to take care of it as representatives of God, because it was a theocracy. And whenever they, as the nation, were not meting out punishment the way it should have been, then they were confusing people about who God was. Frank, I'm going to have to go on. You've already had 2 comments on this verse, and I'm not going to get through if I don't get further. So verse 12, though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God. The beginning pines that the sinner often prospers, and sometimes we fall into that same trap thinking that happens. But the turnabout in the second half of this verse seems unusual and somewhat out of place at times. But it seems like he is going back to the normal spiritual understanding that in the end, the righteous will prosper spiritually. However, verse 13 shows that the wicked will not prolong his days. And so we have this contrast. Will the wicked prolong his days, or will he not? And the idea is, it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, but because he does not fear before God. This isn't going back on what was previously taught, but showing that in the end, God is in control. And that's part of the theme of Ecclesiastes, ultimately, that God is in control. Life may bring a beat down or a windfall for the righteous or the wicked. And that some may prosper. The righteous may prosper, or they may be in poverty, and the wicked may prosper, or they may be in poverty. But while the wicked believes his actions and choices are prolonging his day, life has a way of showing us how little we actually control, and that's the idea. Here's the wicked. He's doing all these things to prolong his life. He's got access to the best medicines and best doctors and cryogenic chambers and things like that. And he thinks, look at me, I'm going to be here forever. But ultimately, what did he say in verse 8? We cannot put off our appointment with death. It's eventually going to come to us. And so that the idea of the wicked trying to do that. Now, when the righteous prospers, he knows that God is still in control and he's still going to die one day. And that's the mentality that Solomon really wants us to have. We think about taking it out of the realm of morality. Many people run, exercise, eat healthy, and what happens to them? They die, right? People run marathons. Some of them die while running marathons. Some of them live to a ripe old age, but eventually what's going to happen? They're going to die like everyone else, just like the people who ate fried foods and didn't take care of themselves and didn't run, didn't work out in any way and just laid around. What's going to happen to them? They're going to die. The healthy will die, the unhealthy will die, the rich will die, the poor will die. The fact is, it happens to every one of us. And so what we're looking for is this idea of fear before God. That's the difference. It's fear before God. You know, because I ate green beans instead of Cheetos doesn't make me more acceptable in the sight of God. But because I showed compassion and assisted my neighbor rather than oppressing the poor, that will change my standing before God. You see, that we're talking about the moral aspect of it. Healthy lifestyles ought to always outlive unhealthy ones, but does that always work? Does the person who runs always outlive the person who doesn't run and exercise? No. It ought to work that way, but it doesn't always work that way. And so we understand there is eternity. While the earth may be unfair to them, eternity in God will be just. So that's what we live for. That's what we look for. Verse 14, there is a vanity that makes or takes place on earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I said that this is also vanity. Notice this is one of those occasions where the preacher has a double vanity. He looks at something and he says, I'm going to tell you something that is vain and is vexing. And then when he tells you, he says, see, that was vain and vexing, just like I told you it was going to be. The emptiness of all this is restated here in that things that ought to be reserved for bad people happen to the righteous people. Sometimes righteous people go to jail for crimes they did not commit, or they're executed for a crime they didn't commit, right? And sometimes wicked people have done wicked, terrible things, and they're never punished. And in fact, they prosper, and they're praised. He says this is vanity. The wicked dig their grave, while the righteous, though, dig their gardens. Knowing that all will die, what are you preparing for? Why is life not fair? I mean, it's kind of what Solomon's saying. Life's not fair sometimes. Why is life not fair? The devil is here, absolutely. What else?
I think on one hand we could consider it mercy from God that life isn't fair. I think a lot of times we want to jump to conclusions and get what we deserve.
Yeah.
But in fact, we don't want to get what we deserve.
Right.
It's a merciful thing.
I want what I deserve when I've done something good. When I've done something bad, I don't want what I deserve. Absolutely. But Mark, free will. That to me is the biggest one. Life is not fair because I cannot make people treat me with respect and justice and love and compassion. Everyone has free will. And just like I can choose to treat someone with love and compassion, they can choose to return hatred and abuse. Right? And that's not fair. It's not fair. So I think that when man has free will, he can choose to infringe on his fellow man. But also, we live in a fallen world where death hunts us. Remember, death entered through sin, right? Romans chapter 5. Death hunts us like a predator. And life is not fair. Man needs to be reminded that justice is not here, but it is there with God. When we look for perfect justice here, we will always be disappointed because who's in charge of meting out justice? Well, God ultimately, but on this earth, man. And man's not always perfect, is he? Or man is never perfect, we might say, right? Makes bad decisions, and that will result in bad times, unfairness. I commend joy, for man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. Here again we see that life and the ability to enjoy it is given to him by God. Instead of spending every day trying to add to our days or even find justice, we ought to seek joy. While moral effort may not prolong our days here, we can find joy in righteousness, knowing that we are storing up our reward for another day. So we enjoy the simple satisfactions under the sun. Mentioned here twice to emphasize that we are dwelling on earthly things or dealing with earthly things. The simple joys: eat, drink, be joyful. It's a common theme in the book. Some may think the preacher overvalues them, but they are not overvalued at all, I don't think. This is the lot that God gives to all people. Yet, like at other times he mentions these joys, he dampens them with a reminder of the darker side of life. It's through the days of his life, while he's on this earth, we're reminded. The eat, drink, and be merry, or eat, drink, and be joyful. These are reminding us that of all the things we can seek for and embrace in this life, the most important or the best one is really joy. Not my joy because I find joy in doing this, that, or the other, but that I find joy in pleasing God. And when I find joy in pleasing God, that's the greatest that we can do. We can fight for justice for all mankind, but Solomon has told us that's basically a losing battle. We can fight to prolong life and cure every disease, but what does Solomon say? That's a losing battle too. But joy in pleasing God and doing what he has called us to do, that's the greatest we can do in this particular life. When I applied my heart to know, here we still have those same phrases. I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep. There are some things we will never know or understand, right? We can lay awake at night wondering about them, but ultimately we will never understand because the secret things belong to whom? God, right. Some things are secret and they belong only to God. God allows us to wrestle with these issues of life. I think that's what the preacher is doing. The preacher applied his heart, as at other times. He wants to understand these inequities. The ultimate question of meaning in life isn't answered through earthly wisdom, though, because earthly wisdom doesn't get it. 1 Corinthians 1:21, for since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God that the folly of what we preach to save those who believe, or through the folly which we preach. And so the world in its wisdom did not know God. In all of its high-brained intellectual pursuits, it did not come to an understanding of God. Notice the evolution of philosophy through history. It exposes man's inherent inability to inject meaning as each successive philosophy gives rise to the next, the new one often setting out to correct the one before it. For example, Aristotle's golden mean. That was his application to what is good in life, what is the best for man is the golden mean. Don't be excessively wicked, don't be excessively righteous. Sounds a little bit like Solomon at times. Let's go straight down the middle, and that's what's best for life. And yet, after Aristotle, it gave rise to the ascetics. The ascetics were a group of philosophers who said, you know what, we need to deny ourselves every pleasure, right? And then that gave rise to the Epicureans, which said, we can't deny ourselves any pleasure. You see, it's correcting. There's so in the middle, we weren't having enough fun, or we didn't feel like we were righteous enough, so we did some self-flagellation, and we became ascetics. And then they said, you know what, we weren't having any fun there, so we went all the other way to hedonism and Epicureanism, which said, do whatever you find that is most enjoyable to you, which gave rise to the unfeeling Stoics. Let's just deny all feelings altogether, each one giving rise to the next one, trying to correct the one before. And guess what? We still have philosophers today who are coming up with new philosophies, and they take a little bit of the philosophies before them and they correct them. The problem is that human philosophy will never ultimately and fully answer the issues that we have. Tim?
You not within man to grasp. It's
Right.
from God. And if you're not God-centered, I think everything else is worthless.
And what he said is it's given, God given. God gives it to man to enjoy, God gives to man to live, and God gives to man to know. Then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. God's work is beyond finding out. That's what Tim's saying. Man can work endlessly over a lifetime and still fail to get the conclusion about God's ways. Even those who claim to know and understand God, we might say, are delusional. Although as time dwellers we see God's work in tantalizing flashes, the very fact that we can ask about the whole design and long to see it is evidence that we are not entirely prisoners of our world. That's Derek Kidner. We see flashes of God's greatness on this earth, but all it does is really sets us up to understand that there is more beyond. There's something better beyond here. But we need to be careful, because sometimes we see, okay, well, we cannot know. God's ways are past finding out, so therefore we cannot know what God anticipates or expects from me. And that's not true. While there are some things that we cannot know, we ought to trust what we can know. We know, for example, that God exists. We know that He is just. We know that He loves us. We know He desires our salvation. We know the plan He has set in motion for our salvation. We know if we have complied or if we have not complied to that plan. The history of flight illustrates this. Man was not created originally to fly, was he? Birds were, but not man. Man eventually came to a point where he could fly, right? Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And in the early days of flight, pilots sometimes would get caught in clouds and things, and they would become disoriented. And they would think that they would feel like maybe they were rolling to the left, and so they would correct and roll to the right. And then find out that they weren't even rolling to the left in the first place, and all they've done is they've rolled their airplane upside down, and many of them crashed. But through the years, we invented instruments, right? The artificial horizon indicator and the different aspects. And so today, pilots train to fly by the instrument panel, right? So that whenever there's no visibility or they become disoriented, they can trust their instruments. That's the way we are. In life, sometimes we're disoriented. We think, well, surely this is not the right way or that's not the right way. God is our instrument panel, and we need to be able to fly by the instruments. Trust God, even whenever it may seem like this can't possibly be the way. Well, this hurts too many people, or it offends someone, or it makes me do things that I don't want to do. And so we start to pitch up or pitch down or roll left or roll right, and we will crash our aircraft. We've got to trust that God knows what He's telling us to do, and He is our instrument panel. So that brings us to chapter 9. Before the positive emphasis of the final 3 chapters can emerge, we must make sure that we shall be building on nothing short of hard reality. In case we should be cherishing some comforting illusions, chapter 9 confronts us with a little that we know, then with the vast extent of what we cannot handle, in particular with death, the ups and downs of fortune, the erratic favors of crowd. First, it asks the crucial question whether we are in the hands of a friend or a foe. Where are we? And so we'll probably have to pick up here. We got a minute or two? Yeah. Let's go ahead and look at verse 1 and 2 here. If I don't look at 1 and 2, we may not actually get done by the end of March, so we better go. But all this I laid to heart, examining it all, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God, whether it is a love or hate, man does not know. Both are before Him. Their deeds are in the hands of God. That is, God knows their deeds, and they will be judged according to those deeds, right? Matthew 16, verse 27, he's going to judge us according to our deeds. Now, whether it is love or hate, and this is where we might seem a little confused, how do we know if it's love or hate? It rests in God's intercourse with man, whether he is a friend or whether he is a foe, whether he is a friend or whether he is an enemy. The creation reveals the existence of God. We understand that. Psalm 19, Romans 1. The ancient religions revealed God or man's ability to see God around him. However, it takes more than mere observation to discover how God feels about man. And that's the question that he has. Whether it's love or hate, I can't observe the creation and say, well, that's love or hate. I can't see the vastness of the universe or the skies and count the stars and say, well, that must mean God loves me or that must mean God hates me. I mean, look how small he has made me compared to everything else. Does that mean God? So we can't do it through the observation of our world. Many of the religions have concluded that God is against man, that he hates man. The religions that were contemporary with Solomon, the ones that were contemporary with the rising church in the first century, many of them concluded that God must hate man simply by observing the creation. They observed that, man, there must be something greater than man, but he must hate us. Or whatever it is must hate us. But from the earthly perspective, the preacher agrees that both conclusions are before man. But why do men think God hates them? Why would a religion come to the conclusion, yes, there is a God, but he hates us? Well, I think part of it is based upon the inequities of life that Solomon has been dealing with. Tim?
Well, it's just like we see the hurricanes, we see the earthquakes, we see the typhoons and the tsunamis. Well, that's nature. But where did nature come from? Well, it was God. So he must be punishing us.
Exactly.
I mean, we've got to blame somebody.
Right.
It sure wasn't us.
It couldn't possibly be us, Tim. But absolutely. It's a good point. We don't live in the pristine Eden, which God created. We live in the aftermath, after sin. The world is definitely a different place than what God originally created. And as a result, we're walking through the train wreck of life, trying to find the other side, trying to find life on the other side. All right, we'll pick up in verse 2 next week.